This morning and turn with me to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3. You can also find this on page 739 in the church Bibles. Daniel chapter 3 or page 739. It is a lengthy text, but I would like to go ahead and read the entirety of it. The rhetoric in it is, I think, intentional to drive home several of the points that our author is trying to communicate. So I think we will feel them if we read it all together this morning. So Daniel chapter 3, beginning at verse 1, says this: King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent, and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast three men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see four men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed. Their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. When I was senior in high school, in between the time of my graduation and going and enrolling in college that fall, a friend of mine and I decided that we wanted to have one last hurrah, as it were. And so me and my friend went to the Spring River in Arkansas. And our goal was to camp there and then to go and canoe the river. You know me well enough by now to know that I like these kinds of things. And so we went, and we were there, and we were set up our camp, and we were camping right on the edge of the river. And that night, the rain came down, and the floods came up, as it were, and the river rose considerably over the course of the night. And when we got up in the next morning, we went down to the place where we were going to rent the canoes, and they told us that we could not rent a canoe because the water was too high, and they were not allowing no canoers. Okay, so what are we going to do? So we went back to the campsite, and we did what any logical 18-year-old young man would do. We decided that even though the river was closed for canoeing, we thought we would go swimming. And of course you would have all done the same, I'm sure. And sure enough, we get out there and we're playing around in the water. And I got out kind of far, and I misjudged how strong the current was. And what I quickly found was that I could not even stand still in this river as it had come up and the current was rushing down, and it started to literally take me downstream. And I have not been afraid for my life many times in my life, but this is one where I started to wonder what was about to happen, because the power of the river was far more, and I can swim, but I could not swim against the current. And so finally it started pushing me downstream, and it was taking me down, and thankfully I was able to kind of swim diagonally with the current. And I was able finally to get over close enough to shore where a tree branch was hanging out over the water. And I grabbed it. And it was all I could do to hold on to, just to give you an idea of what this current was like. I was holding on. The water is splashing against me with the current. But I was able to finally drag myself up to the shore using this tree branch. And I was delivered, thankfully, from what could have been. I wouldn't be here today if what had happened downstream. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like that, but that image, one of fighting against a current and feeling almost helpless in many ways to do anything about the onrushing flow of water, is how I often feel in this world as it comes to our culture and the direction in which life is going, especially for those of us that are Christians. We very much feel like we're trying to stand in a river that is trying to sweep us down along in its ideology. Each and every day, our society is pushing its ideals and values on us with tremendous force. The secular world is doing all that it can to redefine basic morality and truth apart from any reference to God. And when people who believe in God try to stand up in that current, very often the river rages all the more against them. And it threatens to sweep them downstream in an effort to make them either conform or to destroy them under its torrent. The question is, though, as we find ourselves in a world that is increasingly hostile, and actually has been hostile to us all along, and if you've ever felt like that, where the society is trying to push you along, what do you do? How do we handle a situation like that? How do we conduct ourselves in a culture that is increasingly denigrating what we value and mocks what we hold dear? What do we do when we are asked to conform to this new morality or else? Well, I believe that Daniel chapter 3 has something to say about that very subject. Because here we find three believers in God who found themselves in a situation where, as I'm going to show you in a moment, the entire culture was trying to sweep them away. It was trying to get them to conform to a false religious system. It was trying to get them to adopt its values. And if they didn't, it could cost them dearly. How did these men handle it? Well, we'll see here in a moment, and I believe that the way they handle it gives us some idea as to what to do as well. I want to consider just 2 points this morning from this text. The first, I would like us to consider the deadly demands of a pagan world. And then I would also like us, secondly, we'll look at the decisive deliverance. Got all this alliteration, I can't say it. The decisive deliverance of the Most High God. So let's look first of all at the deadly demands of a pagan world. One of the reasons I wanted to read the entirety of the text was that the cadence of the passage itself. Did you notice as I was reading that there were these phrases and words that were repeated over and over and over again? When it opens, we see there that in verse 2, there's this list of great number of people, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, and on and on and on. And did you see how many times that this image that Nebuchadnezzar builds was referenced as being his work? The image that you have set up over and over and over again. And the repetition of the names. All of this is designed to help us feel the power of what's happening in this text. You see, as we consider the deadly demands of a pagan world, I think one of the things we can observe from a text like this is that the world is always attempting to build and listen very carefully, to build a unity around humanly constructed belief systems. Okay, did you catch what I said there? So the world is always trying to create unity around humanly constructed belief systems. So that's exactly what's happening in this chapter. Nebuchadnezzar makes an image, according to verse 1, of gold. He builds it. It's a tremendous image. It says here 60 cubits. That's 90 feet tall. That's roughly an 8-story building. So this thing is this mammoth statue. He sets it up in the plain of Dura, which most scholars believe is just outside the city of Babylon. And then Nebuchadnezzar is using this image as a source to bring about unity among his people in the provinces under a belief system that he has fabricated. If you notice, it is attributed to his work in the repetition of the phrases. Just look at the first 7 verses. Just glance through there with me. Notice verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made. Notice that. Made an image of gold. In the latter part of that verse, he, that is Nebuchadnezzar, set it up. So who has made this God? It's Nebuchadnezzar. This isn't divine origin. This is man-made. Notice that the author just brings it up over and over again. So all the leaders are supposed to come, and what are they going to do? They're to come to the dedication, verse 2, of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. You see that? And then again in verse 3, they're to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And if you missed it, he goes on to talk about it again in verse 5. They're to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. You see how this repetition of the phraseology is designed to help us to see that what Nebuchadnezzar is pushing on these people is something that is man-made. It's a man-made, humanly constructed belief system. But he's expecting unity around this system, isn't he? Did you see the stumbling over all the people that are described as being a part of all of this? Notice there, again, verse 2, who does he call for? He sent. So Nebuchadnezzar sends to gather. Notice that's a bringing together in one. He gathers the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication. That same language is repeated again in verse 3. I won't go through it all again. It is fun though. But notice as well, it's not just them. These would have been the rulers of Babylon. So what Nebuchadnezzar is doing is he's trying to unify his nation. You know, he's a conquering king that has gone to all these different places, and he's conquered lands, and he's now taking those conquered peoples, he's bringing them together, and he's saying, we're all going to worship this God I have created. We have here an example, not certainly the first nor the last, of a political figure using religion for political purposes. Do not think that your politicians are above trying to manipulate you on the basis of religion. Here's Nebuchadnezzar doing it right here. But notice, who does he call? So it's not just the leaders, the elite of Babylon. The proclamation, according to verse 4, the herald proclaims that you are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages. So this is everybody. You see, what is being set up for us in the first part of this chapter is a scenario in which everybody, there's unity. The king, his leaders, his people are all going to be unified around the worship of this false, humanly constructed image. It's almost like the Pied Piper, isn't it? I mean, there's music here too, right? Did you catch all that in the repetition of the instruments? So what's supposed to happen? Well, they're all going to gather, and then Nebuchadnezzar's brought out the symphony orchestra from Babylon, and he's brought them out, and they're literally to follow the piper, aren't they? It says here, verse 5, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image. You're just to follow the piper. And think about this. So here you have a group of people. These are the smartest and the wisest, the leaders of Babylon. And they're just going along with it. And here's the people, because they don't want to cause trouble. They're just going along with it. And it's literally like a puppeteer who's playing. The music starts and the puppet is going on the strings. And here's the culture in Babylon, all unified around a humanly constructed belief system. But notice as well, what if you object? What if there is someone who says, question Nebuchadnezzar, this is a humanly constructed belief system and I object to it. Is there any toleration for that? The answer is no. There is no toleration in this system. Notice that the world in this case is demanding conformity with the threat of punishment. What is it in this case? Look at verse 6. So if you don't do this, it says, whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. Now, why a fiery furnace? Probably because it's there. The great irony of it is, this furnace that these men were eventually thrown into, it was probably the one that was used to construct the statue. So think about what's happened. So the very threat shows that it was a humanly constructed belief system. They had used this furnace most likely to smelt the metal to make the statue. And so the punishment for those who do not conform to this humanly constructed belief system is to be thrown into the very furnace where this humanly constructed belief system was forged. So here they are, the world demanding conformity. Toleration is not offered. There is no room for dissent. And so here the band strikes up and they start playing. And what we find out is that there are three men who stand. The world, the current was going this direction, and there were three men who dared to stand up against the current. Now, they would have probably actually got away with it. It was a large crowd. Nebuchadnezzar apparently did not see them defy his order. But there were some men who saw what had happened. You gotta love the tattletales, right? And so here they were, a couple of the men. It tells us, verse 8, that certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. I wish that that was translated literally. It literally has the idea of chewing on something. So these men come and they are accusing the Jews. They're meaning here Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're really like chewing on them almost, is the idea. And they come and they remind the king of his orders, as if he had forgotten them. And these were men that were probably jealous of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's rise in the nation. And they saw an opportunity to take them down. See, the world does not tolerate dissent. And they see an opportunity then to tear down the people of God. And here it tells us in verse 12 that they come to the king and they say, O king, these men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Notice even their own language betrays the foolishness of what's taking place here. Well, the king is angry. It was a defiance. This was an act of treason. And it says here that the king, is in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. And they brought them to the king. And he asked them point blank, is it true, verse 14, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, or worship the golden image that I have set up. Notice he takes credit for it. But then the gauntlet gets laid down. So here's the demands, the deadly demands of the pagan world. Notice, he's going to give them one more chance which they refuse. It says in the end of verse 15, "But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." And then he asks this question that the whole story turns on. He says, "Who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" What's his expected answer to that question? Does Nebuchadnezzar believe that there is a God who is able to deliver these men out of his hands? He's the most powerful king in the world, or at least he thinks he is. There's no God who can deliver you out of my hand. That's what he's saying. This isn't an actual honest question. He's saying, there is no God that can do that. These are the deadly demands of the pagan world. Well, let's look then, as we look at the remainder of the text, at the decisive deliverance of the Most High God. You ever felt like that? Back against the wall? Here's the world shoving you, trying to shove you into its mold. It's demanding that you conform to its expectations. What are they going to do? They stand. That's what they do. So God's ability to deliver has been questioned, hasn't it? Who is that God who is able to deliver you out of my hands? Well, how did they respond? Verse 17, they say to the king, "Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." So here they are affirming, are they not, God's ability. So they answer his question. Who is the God who's able to deliver you out of my hand? Well, it's our God. We must always affirm as Christians that our God is able. He's omnipotent. He is able to do whatever he wills, including deliver us in the most difficult of circumstances. But there is a question here that we have to wrestle with as well, right? Does God always deliver us in this world? No, he doesn't. And we have martyrs in church history. There's a reason we have them, because God in those cases did not intervene. He allowed them to die. And these Hebrew young men, and this is what I think is so helpful for us to see, do they know for sure that God is going to deliver them in this instance? They don't. They say as much. Look at verse 18. So our God is able to deliver us, they say in verse 17, but if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. You see, what these men were articulating is the same things that Jesus articulated in places like Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus told his disciples, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." You see, what these men realized was, what was Nebuchadnezzar threatening them with? He was threatening them with this fiery furnace, right? He's threatening to burn them. But you know what they understood? They understood that there's a fire that is far, far worse than that. There's an eternal fire of God's eternal wrath that is poured out in a place that we call hell. And they recognized that the God that they served, even if they were killed by Nebuchadnezzar, had far more power. He had power over their souls, where Nebuchadnezzar only had power over their body. This is the same sentiment that Peter and the apostles in Acts chapter 5, when they as well were facing Jewish persecution, they said in response to those people, they said, we must obey God rather than men. And so what they do is they say, King, we don't know what's going to happen. We know our God is able to deliver us. We're not sure that He will, but what you need to understand is that He is our King and not you. And we will serve God rather than men. And they stand, come what may. Well, boy, now the tension is really there, isn't it? Is God going to deliver? Is He not? Nebuchadnezzar is furious with their answer. It says there in verse 19 that Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it usually was heated. The idea almost, as one commentator put it, that as his wrath grew, so do the heat of the furnace. He heats up the furnace, they estimate, scholars estimate, given the furnace technology of the day, that they probably heated this furnace to somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. It's hot enough to melt metal. And it says here that he ordered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be bound and to be thrown into the furnace. They were bound, all their clothes, everything, they were just tied up. They were taken to the furnace. So hot is this furnace, it tells us, that the men who were trying to throw them into it were killed by the heat. That is a hot fire, my friends. But when they're thrown in, Nebuchadnezzar looks up in verse 24 and it says that he was astonished. Now what you need to picture here is probably something like a big, you've seen these little yard chimney, fire pit things that have an opening in the front and then they have a chimney where the smoke goes out. Just picture that, only much bigger. So what's happened is the guys have been thrown into this thing, and he's able to look into an opening in the side where they would have built the fire up. He's able to look in and see, and he looks in there. A fire this hot, what would you expect to see? Nothing. A fire this hot would disintegrate anything that was thrown into it in just a matter of seconds. But he looks up and he calls over his counselors. All these guys that we've been talking about that have gone along with Nebuchadnezzar. Did we not cast 3 guys in there? He said, they answered, said to the king, "Oh, true, king, it is true." And he answered, "But I see 4. What? And notice what they're doing. They're walking in the midst of the fire unbound. They are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Who is that 4th figure? Well, probably God. Some manifestation, it's very possible this could be a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus himself. Walking there in the fire, and they're just walking around like they're having a good time. The ropes burn off, and they're just standing around talking. I don't know what they were saying. That would be an interesting conversation. Look at that king out there. We're having a good time in here. I don't know what they said. But they were astonished. And so Nebuchadnezzar goes to the door of the furnace and he calls them out. And notice how his tune has changed. What was his challenge to them in the first place? What God is able to deliver you out of my hand? Notice how he's talking now. He says in verse 26 that Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, now notice they didn't even leave it. They're just hanging out. And it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of who? The Most High God. Now keep in mind that he's saying this, and there's a 90-foot statue of a God that he just built. Right there. And he says, you are the servants of the Most High God. Guess what God is able to deliver out of Nebuchadnezzar's hand or anyone else's hand? It's the Most High God. And here he brings them out. They examine them. Notice verse 27, the satraps, the prefects, the governors. Notice the repetition. Who are these people? It's the same ones that started in the beginning, right? And they examined him. All the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw that the fire had not any power over the bodies of these men. It had power over the soldiers who tried to throw them in, but not them. And it says there that their cloaks were not harmed. No smell of fire had come upon them. You ever gone camping? What happens after like 5 minutes of sitting by the fire? Everything smells like it, right? But not these guys. Isn't this an amazing miracle? God had delivered them. And notice that so Nebuchadnezzar goes from challenging God to blessing God. Verse 28, he answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And notice what else he says. Down in verse 39, he lays out an edict that you cannot speak against this God. And why? He says, for there is no other God. This is a pagan king saying this. The one who's just built this statue. He says, there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. My friends, that's our God. That's our God. The God who delivers. The God who rescues. The God who saves. So what do we do in this world when the current is sweeping against us? What do we do? It's like what I did in that current. You reach out and you take hold of the branch. You take hold of God who is able to pull you out of the current. You take hold of the God who is able to deliver not only you physically, but spiritually as well. Because we serve a God who, like these men, felt God's or saw God's very presence in that furnace. He has sent His Son into this world. And He has died on the cross to deliver us from sin, to deliver us from death, to deliver us from the flames of hell itself. This is our God. That's right. Trust Him. This is a God worth trusting. This is a God worth banking your soul on. This is a God worth standing for in the current. Come what may, whatever this world is telling you is what we should value. You can just forget it because we need to trust in the God who has power over both body and soul. Trust Him. Do you trust Him? He delivered these guys out of a fiery furnace. He can do the same for you. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this powerful story. Lord, help us to remember just how great a God you are. That as that Psalm 70 said, that your people will come and they will rejoice in your salvation and they will say forever, God is great. And Father, I pray that everyone here would see just how true that is from your word. And I pray that you would give them the faith to trust you even as the tides and the currents of this world rage against us. Give us the faith. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.